Hi, everyone. Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for joining today. So let's get into this. Hi, everyone. My name is Tu David Phu. I'm a first generation Vietnamese American chef, and I love tofu. Today class is Tofu Lab with Hodo Foods. I've been working with them as a friend, as a partner, as an ally for about, I think, close to a decade now. And I really love what they do. They're the first of their kind that I've known, making organic, high quality tofu and other plant-based items for about a decade now. And one of the things that I'm most proud about is the owner is Minh Tsai, is a first generation Vietnamese American. In addition to that, their company's based in West Oakland. I really love who they are. I'm super excited to show you guys why I love tofu. And today's expert from Hodo Soy is a great friend of mine, is Henry Su. He doesn't just know, he's not just a tofu expert, but he makes amazing, amazing dumplings. Henry, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi, how are you?
So let's talk about tofu history and tofu culture and what all this stuff really means. We're also going to talk about um, some facts, some historical facts, and some stigmas that I'm going to ask about tofu history, tofu culture, and tofu health. But can I just pivot over to you, Henry, so you can just give us an introduction on Hodo history, please?
Yes. And hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I'm going to be multitasking here a little bit. I just burned all of the soy milk that I made from scratch this morning. So luckily I have a backup one that was made at Hodo. And but my name's Henry Su. Thanks for having me, Chef Tu. Min cannot be here today. It's actually his birthday, so I'm the sub. And so hopefully I can answer all of your questions and teach you a little bit about Hodo, about tofu making in general, at least from our perspective and what we know. And I'm watching this so I don't burn it as we heat up this milk. But first, I guess, I'm the community manager at Hodo. I do most of the social media events. I've been at Hodo also for about, I guess, 9.5 years, 10 years. So I've known Chef Tu for about that amount of time. When I first started at Hodo, I think Chef Tu was the executive chef at Gather. And and we've collaborated a lot with Chef Tu on his food projects and some of ours. We've done a lot of educational things about tofu making, tofu in general. Check out our YouTube channel, Hodo Foods.
Henry, did you remember there was a tofu chef showdown that we did with me and Chef Safina?
We've done showdowns. We've done events with the history of tofu making and various chefs here in the Bay Area who we got our start. And so I'm at 125 degrees, so I'm gonna, carefully watch this for a little second. I think we're okay.
I think I could switch back from you, Henry, and just add in the fact that Hodo Soy or Hodo Foods, as huge as they are now, they're in all the commercial grocery outlets, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, what have you, Costco, all over the nation, and they're organic. Just to let you guys know, if you guys don't know, they started off at the farmer's market. You know, Minh Tsai was really passionate about making tofu, and through his family recipes, he formulated a recipe to create and bring to the farmer's market, and it was so delicious. Farmer's market after farmer's market, people were slamming his stall. And from there, they established a company and they grew bigger and they grew bigger. And it seems like every year they're selling more and more and more tofu. And I really appreciate that personally, mainly because growing up Asian American and interacting with other folks from different cultures and backgrounds, especially Western American, the first things I get is that, you know, people get a frowny face when they talk about tofu. They're like, oh, it's so bland. That's what vegans eat. Don't get me wrong. I love plant-based food, but I love tofu not because it's plant-based. I love tofu because it's delicious. So back to Henry.
So Hodo, we're based here in West Oakland. Min started Hodo in 2004. So we've been around for 15, going into 16, 17 years now.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
And yes, Min's when he first started Hodo, the idea, and think about, I guess, the culture of the food world in the beginning of the 2000s. Here, at least in the Bay Area, there was a huge artisan food movement, organic food. We're here in Northern California, so we are in some ways a little bit of the breadbasket of the US in terms of some kinds of produce and some kind of all year round growing. Um, and there was this big push for artisan food makers, for organic produce. Farmers market were just burgeoning. So in 2004, when we started, there were probably about 15 to 20 farmers markets in the Bay Area. And in this last few years, we say it's probably 160, 170 farmers markets in the Bay Area.
That's
So
insane.
Hodo, sorry?
That's insane. I was just, that's really insane.
So when we first started, Min's take on this was, I'm able to find all of my organic foods, my artisan foods, but I'm unable to find the same quality and traditional tofus and yubas and soy milks from where he grew up in Vietnam. So it was his task to kind of figure out how to make that available here in the Bay Area. So the first 6 years, we were strictly farmers market and food service. And half of our business is still food service and farmers market and retail. And as Chef Tu mentioned, we are now available nationwide, Canada, and in retail and food service. So food service meaning a full range, because we have farmers market customers still using our products at farmers markets. We have local restaurants. We have some around the country now, once it becomes more readily available to folks. And probably the most famous one for most people, if you don't know, is Chipotle Sofritas. Chipotle uses our tofu nationwide to make the vegan tofu option or the vegan option at Chipotle. So in some weird way, even though this is a really traditional food that has a 3,000-year-old history that we'll talk about a little bit today, we also like to say tofu is the original plant-based protein. So, so we're happy that it's still in existence, that it's common to find around the country and the world, and happy that you guys, yeah.
Awesome.
So, I guess
thank you for that.
We're gonna talk. Sorry.
I said thank you for that, Henry. Could you go into talking a little bit about happy accidents and that history behind that?
So, speaking of tofu in general and being kind of, and sorry, it's a little warm in here. Speaking of tofu and the history of tofu and this kind of happy accidents, like a lot of food things tend to be accidental and how they come onto the plate. And but the interesting thing about tofu for us also, and about how it's made, is it's really, really simple. The first, I'll talk about the happy accident in a second. Let me talk about soybeans first. So as a quick example, this is the dried soybean, and it's round. These are legumes. Soybeans, sorry, which way am I going on here? Soybeans are an amazing source, and legumes in general, of protein. And in some ways, it's speaking today in this world that we live in about sustainability. The amazing thing is that this is this old time-honored way of making protein for your family. So if you have this in storage, dry storage, properly taken care of, you can, within 12, 15 hours, turn this into food for your family. It's an amazing source of protein, calcium, fiber, and other things.
Can I add to that protein statement, Henry, if that's
yeah.
okay? So whenever people think about protein, they think about meat, red meat. Protein doesn't just exist in meats, it exists in almost every living organism, including trees and plants. And they exist in the form of amino acids. Amino acids are a string of things, if you will. If they combine together correctly, they will make protein. And things that you find amino acids in would be seaweed, mushrooms, um, um, I don't know why I'm blanking out, Henry. Mushrooms, cheese, meats, anything that's plant-based. Um, and there's this very Western 1980s, 1970s sort of like false narrative around you can only get protein from meat. You know, just a disclaimer, I'm a meat eater. But it doesn't mean that that's the only source of protein that I get. In Asian diets, protein, animal-based, sourcing protein from meat tends to be a little bit lighter. And it's usually more of a grain, specifically rice-based diet. And for certain regions, they use alternatives to get the protein that they need. For example, in Vietnam, for certain regions by the ocean, which don't have a lot of coral reefs to fish, they use anchovies. Anchovies are high in amino acids. In a lot of parts of Asia, they eat tofu. That's a source of amino acids, thus is a source of protein.
Yeah.
All right, just wanted to add to that, Henry.
Oh yeah, and there's definitely a very holistic way of eating where this food came from. And we'll talk about that in the next 2 hours too, about how culturally it's moved from this really historic thing to where it is today. And let me just kind of show you an example. Oh, so quickly, I'll explain how we, we soak the soybeans overnight, 12 hours. The beans need to, if you kind of can see, they go from round to elongated. So I have been soaking this for overnight. And then it makes all legumes, as you're a bean eater in general, just remember this is a bean. And all legumes need to be cooked for that protein and or other nutrients to become bioavailable to you. So we do today what I did and what we'll do today is a little bit homemade, but it's on an industrial level, it's almost the same thing because it's just soybeans and water. It's such an easy, simple, clean, whole way to eat things. And so we make the soy milk by turning this into a slurry, and then we cook it, and then we strain it. And whatever's left is the fiber, pulp fiber, and we'll go through this process in a bit. But once we get the milk out of it, which this is the one I burned, so I'm going to put it away. And
we'll just call that roasted soy milk, Henry.
And, shoot. Let's see. And then I am gonna grab this.
Okay. So just to add, by the way, the okara is a pulp and you can eat that. So let me see.
Yeah.
Oops, Henry, I muted you on accident. Can you unmute yourself? There you go. Sorry, Henry.
It's okay.
You're good.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So okara is the Japanese name for the pulp byproduct that we remove to make the soy milk. So this is a lot of fiber and it still has a lot of nutrients. At Hodo, we send most of it it's picked up by local organic ranchers and farmers. So we don't have any waste in that regard. And then we've also worked with Renewal Mill. I don't know if anyone's heard of Renewal Mill, but look them up. Renewal Mill was started, gosh, a few years ago, and
I think about 6 or 7 years ago, huh, Henry? Maybe
six
like
or
mid
seven years
2000s.
ago,
Yeah.
and they are we're graduates from Yale forestry program, and we're really into sustainability and food waste and upcycling it for human consumption. So Renewal Mill also had incubated at Hodo for a few years and kind of learned the process, and now have created a product that you can find on store shelves that is okara based flour for cooking.
Amazing.
So look, you can look that up, Renewal Mill. So
Awesome.
okay, and so I know this is a moving target type of thing, but since it's here, and I know I'm jumping around here a little bit, but because the milk has kind of warmed up, I just want you guys to see that the skin that forms on top, and not to be too protein focused, because I know, like Chef, what you were intimating about, we're so protein focused, and most likely if you have a good, diverse diet, even if you are vegan, you can potentially get all your protein from leafy greens, from a variety of carbohydrates, like whole grains and a variety of other things. But anyway, this is Yuba, the skin that forms on top, which is also, again, the Japanese name for tofu skin,
How
bean
cool is
curd
that?
sheet. And this is a product that we sell and make. I don't know, Chef Two, if you have that package there.
Yes, I
But
can show you guys really quick. This is one of my favorite products from Hodo Soy. It's organic Yuba sheets, and that's exactly what Henry was just showing us before, but they package it for you. And when you open it, you have these beautiful sheets of tofu milk skin. And I've used this in a lot of different interesting ways. You could use this like a spring roll or summer roll. You can roll this up and pan fry it, stuff it with legumes, stuff it with rice, anything. It's super delicious. My fiance just made kimchi jjigae, and we tore this up into noodles and then threw it into the kimchi jjigae. And it's a low carb, high protein, super silky, not dry, not overcooked way to eat a noodle. So highly recommend it.
so this is interesting because it's unlike tofu, which I know we have to get back to, but this is a predecessor to tofu. Is Tofu is 3 ingredients. Tofu is soybeans, water, and a coagulant of some sort, which we'll get to in a second. Yuba or tofu skin is simply water and soybeans, heating it up and then removing this layer. Most often you can find it in Asian grocers, dehydrated or frozen.
It's not the
Hodo,
same. They taste like
Hodo,
crap.
but
I'm
it does.
sorry.
It's really nice fresh because it has a really good sweet milky flavor to it. And not to focus on protein again, but quickly, it's just so you know, one sheet is approximately 2.5 ounces and about 21 grams of protein. So one sheet that's only 100 calories is potentially half an adult's protein for the day. It's equivalent to the protein found in chicken breast, for example.
Wow.
So this actually is a product that is, or a food that is used in traditional Chinese Buddhist culture for making mock meats. So quite often seitan, which is vital wheat gluten, sometimes yuba or tofu skin are used to mimic meat because it is really dense. And we have a YouTube video on our website that explains, and on our recipes page that explains how to make mock meat with yuba. But you can look at that later. But the idea here is to explain kind of that this is just it's a unique food product and something that's kind of fun to work with. And it's very nutrient dense. We have a lot of vegan bodybuilders that are eating this in order to bulk up in a lean way also, but it's interesting. but it's really versatile. It has great culinary value, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, I'm gonna put this
And if I
down.
could for the fact too is that for those of you who haven't had Hodo products yet, the difference is with my opinion, with an inferior product or an alternative product that isn't as fresh as Hodo or not even organic bean based, I find that there's a chalky chemical taste to it because there's a thing that they do in their process to make sure their tofu coagulates. But back to you, Henry. We could talk more about that. I don't want to take
Okay, thanks for prompting me. We'll go back to the tofu coagulation. So, so back to the happy accident thing. Here's a little bit of soy milk. Is it there? And so there's a lot of, the fiber has been mostly removed from here, but the proteins, our soy milk is really thick. We tend to make a pretty heavy soy milk. Our soybeans also are known to be really high in fat. And
like the heavy cream of soy milks, right, Henry? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what I have here is Chinese black vinegar. And just a little bit should begin to curdle it. So whether it's salts or vinegar or like in Chinese, in what we say it's Chinese style tofu, but that's simply just because where it originated. But calcium sulfate or gypsum, or for lack of a better term, drywall, which is fun to say. But this is a food grade gypsum or a food grade calcium sulfate, which is the naturally occurring mineral. Is the recipe that we use at Hodo. In China, where tofu originated a few thousand years ago, and this style of curdling actually is something that we still eat. My family, for example, is from Taiwan. You can go to stalls in the morning and have tofu done this way, and then there's vegetables, pickles, toppings that go into here.
So that's like a cottage cheese, right, Henry? Like a cottage cheese-like texture.
Yeah, and we call it Taiwanese breakfast, even though I'm sure in China everyone's doing this also. But so this is kind of this happy accident, right? Like where you curdle, just like in cheese making, you have tofu or the protein curds, and then you have the water, the whey that's going to be expelled. So in China, calcium sulfate is the primary coagulant, traditional coagulant.
Can I add to that, Henry, about the calcium sulfate, just so people have a clear understanding? So calcium sulfate is similarly an ingredient you would find in tofu making, just as much as you would see iron in cereal. It doesn't mean they're going out to the mines and mining out iron to put in your cereal. It's just a naturally occurring element that happens to be in the process of cereal. And that iron that you eat, you grind up cereal and water and put a magnet to it, you'll see the iron pull away from the blender. And this is the same kind. All this stuff is food grade. So don't think that, there's some sketchy person in a basement, breaking down drywall from recycled construction to make tofu. That's not the case. I just wanted to be very clear about that. Okay.
But I suppose if you needed to, it's possible. But
that's a YouTube episode, Henry.
That's true. So pantry items, the wall. But so when tofu traveled actually to Japan, for example, in Japan they did not have access. And originally when tofu traveled to Japan, it went with actually Buddhism or vegetarian Buddhism. So it's interesting because even though in Asia, tofu is often cooked with meat, and just like you were saying earlier, it's just people eat less meat in general, but it's just a combination of the whole. There is a history of vegetarian Buddhism with the mock meats that I was kind of mentioning. And when tofu moved to Japan, and specifically to Kyoto, Nara region, which is the religious center, and where you will find in Kyoto up to 60 or 80 Yuba shops that are family run.
Wow.
Min went to Japan and studied there, and kind of so anyway, we have a range of different kind of Yubas, but mostly for food service because it doesn't have a very long shelf life. But the thing is, in Japan, they did not have calcium sulfate. Just being an archipelago, and being a seafaring nation or region, they were actually Japanese tofu is made with nigari, which is actually a different process, but to curdle the proteins and the fats from soy milk into tofu. So, and nigari is sodium that's derived from the ocean. So whether it's from seaweed or seawater, and it has a different cooking process. And as you also mentioned, Chef Tu, contemporary tofu making often will have other synthetic coagulants or other things that kind of form it and keep it together. At Hodo, we're pretty traditional. It's just water, soybeans, and calcium sulfate.
And there's other things that you can use to coagulate tofu as well too. Myself and David Barsley, which are Barsley is an amazing internationally acclaimed pop-up chef here in San Francisco Bay Area restaurant Lazy Bear. But him and myself, we used to make silken tofu a la minute, meaning we made silken tofu to order like tableside for our diners. And one of the things that we experimented with before Henry and Min taught me about calcium sulfate was we used to use ginger skin. And if you juice ginger skin, there's an enzyme in ginger that if you add that ginger juice to 165 degrees Fahrenheit plus of soy milk, it will coagulate and it will turn into silken tofu. The only thing about that was, and this was a pain in our butts, was that that enzyme that exists in that ginger skin, it's only fresh and only lives for about 5 to 10 minutes. So if you juice it and let it sit and it goes past 10 minutes, your silken tofu doesn't work. And that's a fun fact for you guys to know. In addition to all this is ginger. If you have ginger skins, they have amazing enzymes in them. They're super delicious. If you clean your skins enough and wash them so that they're super clean, once you peel the skin, you could throw them into a tea, you go throw them into your stocks, throw it into your stir fry. Though that is a crucial, beautiful flavor that you don't want to get rid of. Sorry, Henry, I'm geeking out on food right now.
No, that's good. It's interesting. Because there's also, people also use lemon juice, I've heard. And
you use lemon juice, right?
Which is funny thinking about that now, because lemon juice is often used with regular milk if you don't have buttermilk for a recipe, for example, regular dairy milk. So I don't know we need more research to or education to know all these different ways of coagulating the milk. Oh, you can see there's more Yuba forming. I should get it out.
So can you guys see how laborious that process may be? If you have a pot on the stove and you have to like harvest the sheet, you could probably harvest the sheet, in a pot, maybe like every 15 minutes, right, Henry? So to get a full package, it takes forever. That's why I love the fact Hodo Soy makes organic Yuba sheets, because they're really good. It's really high quality, and I don't have to sit over a stove for like 5 hours. Yuba, right?
I know we've had restaurant partners say that they sat here and did this for a service, for a restaurant, regular service, and they're just like, we can't. It would take forever. And this process, even at Hodo, our tofu making, obviously we need to use machines, but we design our machines so that they are partially, this is for the tofu making, that they're partially artisan, hand formed, and then there's the hard work is done with machines. But when we make our Yuba, though, the Yuba has to be 100% handmade. There's no, after years and years of people trying to mechanize it to have that same quality, they're unable to achieve it. Okay, so this is hot. This is ready. I don't know where we're at in terms of time at all, or where we are.
Oh, right now we are at 1:30. Right now, 1:30 p.m. Henry. We are great on time, my friend.
Okay, This is ready to make tofu if we want to do it.
Sure, whatever your timing is, Henry. We could do it now.
Okay.
Or whenever you're ready. We don't rush the tofu, right, Henry? You never rush the tofu. You wait for the tofu. The tofu does not wait for you, right?
Yeah. And this is a really, and even though it's difficult and I burned it earlier and all this kind of stuff, once you're doing it regularly, you could probably do a pretty good. I mean, it's really simple in some ways. So let's see. Let me move some of these things out of the way. I don't know. Are there any questions right now? Maybe, I don't know, that we can chat about.
Let me look through the list. What about gypsum, babe? Oh, people are asking where you can get gypsum. I found gypsum on Amazon, and all gypsums alike. There's no higher quality or lower quality. But also,
there are. You should find food grade. There are cleaner food grade ones. Yeah.
I retract my statement. Make sure you get food grade.
But I would, unfortunately, unless you live somewhere that has a lot of DIY or whatever, you probably, or beer making uses calcium sulfate. So if you have shops where you can support locally, but otherwise online you can find stuff. Here in our area, we have a shop called Preserved Goods in the Temescal in Oakland, and they have a lot of DIY stuff, including things like this. And
here's a great question from Flo Henry. She asked, what's the difference between Nagari and calcium sulfate in the tofu making process?
So I've never made it with Nagari, but at Hodo we have done some here and there. And the process, from what I know, is it's a really good question, but it'll make more sense in a second when I make the tofu. But essentially, calcium sulfate or gypsum tofu making is quick. It's almost automatic. And then for Nagari, it's a cooking process where you keep stirring and cooking until you get it to the texture that you want. If you notice, Japanese tofu tends to be very smooth. It's it's from whether it's medium tofu, soft, silken, or firm Japanese, it's always really smooth. And then sometimes when you have calcium sulfate or gypsum tofu, you'll notice it can get chalkier and chalkier. And the firmer it gets, the chalkier it gets. And that's the nature of some of the coagulants that are used and the amount of coagulant that you're using. So I'll explain that process right now. Let me grab a couple things. This is ready.
And if I could add to that really quickly too, I've had experience with Nagari and calcium sulfate. Nagari comes in liquid form. Calcium sulfate comes in powder form. The form, you have to mix it with water. And prior to pouring your soy milk in, you have to make sure that solution of water and calcium sulfate is readily mixed. Opposed to the Nagari, is just like a few drops. And I would echo absolutely what Henry says. The calcium sulfate will get chalkier if you let it sit longer. So if you're eating tofu fresh and using calcium sulfate, there's not much of a difference. But if you're letting it sit a little bit over, there will be a little bit of a difference for the Nagari. In addition to that, you have to be very mindful of how much calcium sulfate you put into it. So it's very important to be precise. I've given you guys a recipe, just to echo that recipe real quick. It's 1 cup of soy milk, a tablespoon of water, and about 1/5 of a teaspoon of calcium sulfate. But Henry will go over it now. And of course, if you guys have questions beyond this class or even in this chat, we'll go over it again in the Q&A. And while you're setting up, Henry, I could just answer quickly Jason's question about Yuba. Jason, Yuba is incredibly difficult. Yuba, let's call it tofu skin, it's synonymous. That process will work with any milk. Soy milk, goat milk, cow's milk, whatever milk, if you do that process. And if you were attempting to do it at home, incredibly difficult task. Put a small pot of soy milk on the stove. You want to bring that soy milk up to about 165 degrees. As skin starts to form, the best way to harvest it is either with your 2 fingers, or you could try to use a sheet of plastic wrap or even a linen cloth to kind of touch and drape the top and pull it off. And the hard part is gauging the time that the skin forms thick enough so that you can be able to harvest it without breaking the skin. So let's go back to Henry. Henry was spotlighting your table.
Okay.
So it seems like, Henry, you brought the soy milk up to 165 plus. That's 165 Fahrenheit degrees. He's
Yeah,
poured into
and
the
then,
pitcher.
yes, thank you. And then I poured it into this pitcher and I'll explain why in a bit, but it's easier for me. Here's the calcium sulfate. We have recipe available. Chef 2 can send it out later. But this is the calcium sulfate that I have. This is from Hodo, and the one that we use. And so calcium sulfate is not water soluble. So,
meaning it doesn't mix. You have to keep on mixing it. If you don't mix it, it'll settle to the bottom. That's what Henry.
Yeah, right now I'm freshly mixing it, so it's suspended in the water. But normally, if you let it sit for a bit, when you're doing this, you'll see that it clears up and settles to the bottom. So if you're doing this, just make sure that you remix it before you pour. And then let's see how this works. It's always
nice.
And the reason I did it on here is with the pitcher is because, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that it's automatic. I want to make sure it's a smooth, continuous, big pour. And I want to make sure that it's evenly distributed through. And that's why I kept pulling off all that extra Yuba, the solids. I took off because those solids will interfere with the smoothness of this. And the thing about it is, if you're having, and this is a good time to talk about silken tofu, medium tofu, firm tofu. People often will ask, what's the difference between these kinds of tofus? And it's just water content. So this is, how many seconds or minutes ago was it that I just did this?
Maybe like 45 seconds.
I don't know if you can tell from the camera, but it's basically done.
Yeah, that's the jiggle test. As you can see, when I say the jiggle test, when Henry's jiggling it, it would ideally, if in a liquid format, it would splosh out of the bowl, but it's not.
And so the test is, if you're having silken tofu, especially as Chef 2 was mentioning, a la minute or at tabletop or fresh, or if you're at a street market in Asia, what happens is, let's see. That silken tofu is done.
That's beautiful,
what will
Henry.
happen, sorry?
I said, that's beautiful, silken tofu.
And so it's also important to me, these are these typical IKEA bowls, if you can see it from the side in the other view. Oh, let's see. Can you switch back to that front view?
I'm sorry, Henry. Yep.
Oh, it's okay. So see the bottom of this bowl? For me, it's really important to have it be as round as possible. So these are these, inexpensive IKEA ones. And the reason I find this important is it gives it an opportunity for the coagulant and then that hot soy milk to come through and
mix
evenly without creating eddies where it kind of pushes solids into liquids and then it makes it uneven. And the reason this is important, if you're not familiar with this, from Asia, is that people will judge your silken tofu. People will judge how smooth it is. if it's done properly.
Can you imagine the gossip, Henry, where people were like, "Did you see that guy Silken Tofu? I don't know how he was raised."
So this was gifted to me by somebody from Singapore, but it really makes a difference. This kind of spoon is specifically for silken tofu. If you see this, how thin it is. But because the idea here is that you're able to come through, you don't want those. You're never gonna serve anyone bubbles, even from a street stall, they would remove that. So and then in Mandarin, in Chinese at least, we call this douhua, and that means bean flour. So essentially, the tofu coagulate lifts up, and then you do this, and then you have these thin layers. I think Chef 2 is going to be showing you how he plates and serves this, but quite often it'll be served like this.
Nice.
In really smooth format. And then in these two other bowls here, I have firm tofu that maybe you guys are familiar with from Hodo, which is this one. And as well, this is a medium tofu, but we'll talk about that in a bit when we go through the tofu making process. But you can see the tofu's here.
Beautiful.
Silken tofu retains, as you know, because you watch the process, 100% of the water. Medium tofu will go into a press, which we're about to do, and retains a little bit more water. I mean, a little less water. And then firm tofu has been pressed longer. So it's essentially the same recipe. It's just about how much it's been pressed and formed.
Awesome. Thank you, Henry. I'm just going to show you guys how I like to make my silken tofu and what's traditional in Vietnamese culture. And then while Henry's silken tofu sits a little bit, we're going to pivot back to him to show you guys how to do a pressed tofu, okay? So this is my silken tofu. And when I do silken tofu, I like to serve a person a whole bowl. And this is the sweet version of it. And this is served as a dessert. Similarly, the same way you would see flan or any other like custard-based pudding. And per what Henry said, it's great as a dessert for me because it's silky, it's unctuous, it's creamy, it's fatty. It's everything that I know of tofu growing up, okay? So I did a little bit of, it's super simple. You do the same process as we did with Henry. And then I'm gonna serve it with a little bit of ginger simple syrup. Ginger simple syrup is like half an ounce of sliced ginger, a cup of water, a cup of sugar. You bring it to a boil and you let it cool down. You serve it warm. And all you do is pour this beautiful, delicious ginger syrup into your bowl. And then as you dig into it, right, you're gonna have a beautiful spoon of ginger syrup with that. So this ginger syrup will serve almost, it's the same purpose a caramel would be paired with a flan. So very similar. We're gonna dig into that in a second. And here's another version is you can also have silken tofu because tofu is so versatile. You do it in a savory way. So in the savory fashion, let me grab a spoon. I just pan roasted up some shiitakes with some sesame oil, some avocado oil, some ginger, and then some salt, pepper. Very simple. Okay. Here's some fried shallots, and then here's some scallions. But most importantly, there needs to be a sauce. This is tamari with a little bit of rice vinegar. And every opportunity I get, I always have to let people know about my Tumami Spice store. It's tumamispices.com. I feature Asian artisanal producers and products that I find both domestically and internationally. This is coming out of Texas. This is a Vietnamese lemongrass chili paste, which I love, tiger satay. And this is called charuk mate. For those of you who like sambal, and these are all plant-based, by the way, but for those of you who love sambal, you need to try Cambodian Churuk mate. I love this stuff. It's super delicious. I like it more than sambal. I like it more than sriracha, mainly because it has a lot of savoriness. In other words, umami. Okay. So into my dressing, I'm just going to put some churuk mate. And then I'm going to put some lemongrass chili paste. And that's a very common thing, FYI, in Asian cuisine, specifically Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, is that people think of spice as one-dimensional. I think of spice, well, Vietnamese folks think of spice in many different dimensions, meaning it offers a lot of different flavors, very similar to Mexican cuisine. So these were two different types of chilies. One was fried in oil, the other one was fermented. So with this beautiful sauce, I'm just going to layer it into my bowl. And I like a lot of it. I am going to be ruthless with my sauce because it's so good. Unapologetically, okay? And then I'm just going to go back and then put some of these roasted shiitake mushrooms. And I really love to eat this way. This is a great alternative too. Like if you don't want to eat rice, you can make silken tofu. It's low glycemic, meaning it's not high in sugar, but it will give you the same sensation that rice does. At least that's my interpretation of it. Then for some texture, I'm just going to garnish this off with some, actually let's do some scallions first. Here's some shaved and sliced scallions. And then for texture, I'll do some fried shallots. How fun is that? Right? Voila. Right?
Amazing.
That's a savory silken tofu. And here's our ginger syrup. Now back to Henry, okay?
Okay. Yum. Wow.
Thank you, Henry. Okay, now back to Henry.
Okay, so this is, let me, oh, I can't find the thermometer. But when you make your silken tofu, and you want to save it as silken tofu, just leave it as is, right? So, because it retains 100% of its water. But how do you achieve making firm or medium tofu? You need to press it somehow in some kind of tofu box. So what I have here is something that you can find also online. There are many kinds of boxes out there. This particular one, I think, is Japanese wood, so it has a nice scent to it, but it's hinoki, and it has 3 parts. And you can see there are a lot of holes here. And I've pre-soaked this in water just so that, because we're putting a lot of water into here, we don't want anything to get swollen or not.
Can I make a quick connection, Henry?
Yes.
And because that box is square or rectangle, depending on how you interpret that, or depending on the shape of the box, that's why pressed tofu is usually square, traditionally. FYI. Okay.
Yes, and I apologize. We can go backwards a little bit, but because we were gonna, besides burning all the milk that I made this morning, I was gonna show you the process of squeezing out the okara and making the tofu, because I'm using a box here. But if you're making a medium tofu, or like the Japanese have a shirae, Shirae in English, or Roman letters, which is a really soft, mushy tofu that's often used for salads or for cooking with. What I'm squeezing out right now is water from a cheesecloth, but I've seen people do that by hand, and just hand squeeze it. Have a ball of tofu that's kind of loose and mushy, and then use that to cook with too. So there's many ways, but we're using a box here, and especially firm tofu. We haven't talked yet about the history of how tofu arrived in this country, which we can get to. and why firm tofu actually also is known to exist. You don't really find firm tofu much in Asia. Here in the US, you know, in the 60s and 70s, tofu, there's a really good book called The Book of Tofu by Bill Shirtleff, and who's also local to here in the Bay Area. And I forget the name of his partner, oh my gosh, but she's Japanese. And they talk about tofu, but, you know, and it's funny now in this day and age, especially with the plant-based food world and just people looking for tofu more, and we can talk about that too in the retail space. But in general, firm tofu, when it came to the US, or was developed in the US, it was going to be a meat replacement, right? So the culinary value here in Western world was that this was going to save the world. Don't eat meat, and then use it as a kind of meat replacement. So the softer ones were not familiar to people. The firmer, the better. A lot of recipes that you see will often talk about pressing out even more water. Put books on it, rocks on it, like all the old school vegetarian cookbooks in the US, all are sort of related to that. And we'll talk about that too in the next part with Chef 2 about the culinary uses and the different kinds of tofu and how you can flavor tofu. But in any case, let me do this because this is time sensitive and I'm blabbing. But so here's a cheesecloth. And maybe I should switch this. Okay, I'm gonna break this up and switch it up. So here's that beautiful silken tofu we made. Oh, maybe the top view. Let's see.
There you go. 1 second here. There
you go.
Nice.
So I am now breaking up the curds in the way. So I don't care about how beautiful that tofu is anymore. And I want to do this while it's still hot. And then this has been soaking. And I'm gonna lay this wet cheesecloth in here.
Nice. Henry, quick question. Why is it so important to soak the box in the cloth? What does that do?
Because what we're putting into it is wet, and we don't want everything to stick to the cloth and to the box. And sometimes if, you know, this is well designed, but I've used ones before that aren't, where when they start to bulge up, then you can't open the box. You can't get the tofu out. So you just want to pre-soak everything so you know it's the osmosis or the ratio of water is equal inside and outside. That's right. So it just keeps it from sticking. So this is ready.
A question from Judy, Henry, after your process. But
sorry, what was that?
I said we have another question from Judy about soy milk, but we'll do it right after your process. Yeah.
And I don't know what you can see here because let's see.
That looks great, Henry.
Okay. So the curds, this is going in like this.
Nice.
And then I will now try to and then if you can kind of see, that's why those holes are on the bottom, not on top, so that it can help release all the water out. And then you just hold and press for as long as you can.
Work those forearms, Henry.
and then perhaps this is when you can pull out your weights, your rocks, and your other things.
Can of tomatoes.
And I probably let it cool off too much. It's got to be hot for this to form properly. So we'll see how it goes in a little bit. I'm going to leave it to the side and let the water keep coming out on its own.
So it seems like, Henry, you've been having that's been pressed for about, say, 30, 40 minutes, you would say?
I think so. And I can see there's still, you can see there's still a little water in there coming out. But, okay. Oops.
And would you call this like medium tofu press?
I think this would be between Yeah, like a very light medium, perhaps. Let's see.
Got it. Well, that's great, Henry. Look at that. Wow. Clapping it up for Henry. Yeah, look at that.
Hold on. Let me see.
That looks great, Henry.
Oops. So this is really soft. So let's see.
But we get the idea for sure. Nice. Money shot. Nice.
Let's see. It smells good.
That looks great, Henry.
Okay, I'm gonna taste it.
Okay.
Tofu.
That's awesome, Henry. That's great, Henry. That's awesome. So to answer Sal's question is that I think with the weight and poundage that Henry put on it, it's anywhere from like 5 maybe to 15 pounds of pressure initially. And then he let it sit for anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes to get to that state. Mm-hmm. If you want it any firmer, you have to put a lot more weight and you probably have to go a lot longer. What's the process at Hodo, Henry, just so we can all know what it takes to make firm tofu?
I think that, as you guys saw with calcium sulfate, it was almost immediate to coagulate. Mm-hmm. So the way our machines work, it's individual bowls that get dumped out to make these slabs that are about 10 pounds. And that process, so it's automatic to coagulate.
And then they use a mechanical press, right? To press all the water.
And then when it gets dumped out, we have a mechanical press after humans do the cheesecloth, because we designed it so that it's half human, half machine. So because there are certain things machines can't do.
Yeah.
We don't think, or it's not the way that we've developed our tofu making. And wait, the question was, and so, and then once it goes to the press, because that part is machine, I think it's 7 minutes for the firm, and then medium, we have something that doesn't allow it to push all the way. And you guys also, when you go to our, if you go to Hodo Foods on YouTube, or you do a Google or online search, look up the Exploratorium, and they did the Exploratorium is a museum here in San Francisco, and they did a short video on and shows our facility and how it's done. So if you want more visuals.
So just to answer your question, Sal, it's not about how long, it's about how much pressure gets pushed out, and it's all about water content. So if you can just press, the harder you press, the shorter the time. Because they have mechanical presses, that would take them about 7 minutes to press. And that's a lot more strength than we human beings can have through a machine, if that makes any sense. If you're really looking for firm tofu, I would advise strongly just to probably buy your firm tofu opposed to making it. But anything that's lighter than firm tofu, you should absolutely do yourself. And as you could see, Henry did it fairly easily, but that's because Henry's an expert. He made it look so easy.
And this one I just tasted is so much softer than our medium even. And if it's not technically a silken, but for a mapo tofu or a agedashi tofu, this would be the classic, maybe a classic texture.
You hear that, Sydney and Peter? You should do that recipe that Henry just did in this video. That would be perfect for mapo tofu.
This is medium tofu, and this is firm tofu. Medium tofu also, unfortunately, we cannot really sell in regular retail because it has a very short shelf life. It's for food service, and we sell it at the farmer's market. But this essentially is our firm tofu that you're familiar with, perhaps. And this is, how do you say it? Has been squeezed down longer. if you can tell, I'm not sure. It's very dense. It's very smooth. And we don't water pack it. And our medium tofu is essentially probably the same recipe, and it's just been pressed down longer. So right now it's got more air and more water in there. So, but the firm they're really, anyway, I can't say this, but I think they're really delicious. They're really smooth, they're really sweet. And so that will affect also the nutritional value, for example, because this is more water and air, this is much more dense. We have a lot of chefs and home cooks that tell us that they're happy because they don't need to press this. In case you're doing a recipe that calls for not wet tofu.
Okay, so because tofu is so versatile, it could take up almost any flavor. And I find the ones that are my favorite, fried tofu nuggets, curry and 5-spice. And I could just snack on these. These feel like a more moist version of jerky for me, mainly because that tofu just takes up these flavors so well. And these are both plant-based. And I throw these in everything. Even when, I need a quick meal, I'll just have some fresh noodles lying around, cook up the fresh noodles, pour out the water, and then toss them with either or. It's a great, nutritious, super delicious meal. There's also these marinated tofu cubes. So these two were fried, which I love. And these two are just firm tofu cubes diced up and marinated. Because tofu is fairly porous, I find that in cooking them, they take up any sort of flavor they throw at you, whether it's barbecue sauce, harissa, olive oil, and it does so without being very intrusive, meaning if I marinated this with a Greek Italian sort of flavoring, it would taste Greek/Italian flavoring. If I put a barbecue sauce over it, it would taste like barbecue sauce. And that's one of the great versatile things I love about tofu. Let me show you guys the barbecue. They also have the barbecue tofu cubes as well, and the Moroccan. Yes, I love to cook at home, but just FYI, these are great to have in your fridge quickly, especially if you have a family and you're working full time and whatnot, and there's not a lot of time that you spend behind the stove and kitchen. These are always great. Or even for those days that you don't want to cook, right? Pull these things out. I love this stuff. And I'm telling you that I'm loading up my fridge. I'm always loaded up with this stuff. I think I've mentioned to you guys before, for those who participate in previous classes or we see my previous social media posts, is that I am pre-diabetic. My parents, there's a gene of diabetes on both sides of my maternal and paternal family. So I'm always trying to find creative ways to steer away from starch or high glycemic food items like rice or even rice noodles. And given that I'm Vietnamese, that's a fairly difficult thing to do. And these organic Yuba sheets makes it really, really easy. FYI.
I do have one thing that I forgot to mention, because
Yes.
people often ask us, and we can talk a little bit about the plant-based food world. And I know this last year has been crazy with the pandemic, people eating more at home, people cooking more, people looking for ways to access things. I think the plant-based food set world, people are looking for clean meat alternatives and or other things. But it's just interesting, like the history of when tofu came to this country. And as I mentioned before, the thing about firm tofu being kind of an American invention. And in the same vein, it's funny, this is kind of an anecdotal thing, but tofu back in the it's curious because you'll find tofu now with meat alternatives or the plant-based set becoming so big. You can find in a lot of grocery stores, even conventional ones, not the Whole Foods or your co-op or your local whatever. I mean, we're available at Target right now, nationwide. Safeway in Northern California right now is doing this big veganuary push, which is this UK initiative to eat less meat. And this is the first year that US retailers are getting into it. Everyone's kind of amplified their plant-based set or their vegan set. And in the grocery space in the States, it's funny because tofu you used to find only in the produce section, if you remember this. Now there may be a kind of a separate section, and sometimes you had to find your tofu over here and then go to the plant-based set to find things as well. And so the history of tofu in this country is a little interesting because I'm like, why is tofu sitting in the produce section? So I learned this from one of our friends over at another plant-based company at Tofurky, and they were just like, you have to understand that in the 50s, when the Japanese farmers, when Japanese grocery stores, when Japanese farmers, Asian farmers were bringing produce to grocery stores, they were also bringing tofu in buckets. And people didn't know what it was or how to deal with it or where to put it. So it's always kind of been placed, it was just kind of set in the produce section. So it's interesting to see how far it's come and how it's kind of morphed and changed over the years. But little by little, it's more understandable and acceptable to people. So, and I know, Chef too, we were talking about things that people freaked out about soy, about how it's changed over the years and stuff too. But anyway.
Let's talk about that, Henry. That's the elephant in the room, I think, for a lot of people. Well, in particular myself, maybe I'm being selfish. But let's talk about tofu and the claim that it raises estrogen in men's and little boys and whatnot. And could you talk about men's health and what they did and a few other national publishers or what is it, news organizations that came out and spoke to that a few years back?
Yeah. I mean, I know everyone that's joined us here today is probably not afraid of tofu and not afraid of soy. But there are a lot of people out there that, and you guys may have family or friends that are not into it for different reasons. The phytoestrogen aspect, people don't want to give it to boys. We've heard it all. And sure, soy is a top 10 food allergen in this country. So if you're allergic to soy, stay away from it. And also there's a genetic marker for some women and men who, for breast cancer, if you're allergic or you have that genetic marker, people will know to stay away. But otherwise, it's considered to be a very good, clean source of nutrients. The American Heart Association, I think, says 25 grams of soy protein per day from a healthy source in a healthy diet actually protects you from certain things. But the big thing that we deal with a lot, have dealt with a lot, is that people kind of freak out about soy and consuming it for the estrogen factor. And so most of that has been debunked. I think there was a doctor from the early 90s or something, or late 80s, that said that, brought up all the stuff that has stuck in everyone's head, that it's not good for you. But what Chef 2 was just mentioning was that if you look up on our website, on our press page, or if you happen to look for this article from Men's Health magazine from 2018, a couple years ago, they did a feature about why tofu is good for people, men specifically, for Men's Health magazine, and they did a mea culpa and apologized for being a part of spreading that misinformation back in the day. So if you do have friends that are afraid of it for some reason, look for that article.
Awesome. Thank you, Henry. Yeah. Awesome. I think that's it. We should wrap it up, Henry. This was so much fun. I'm always super excited about tofu. You're welcome. I'm super excited about tofu. Thank you for joining me today, Henry. You could find myself at Chef 2 David Fu. Hodo on Instagram, same thing for Hodo Foods, is just at Hodo Foods. And Henry is probably one of the best dumpling makers I know, in addition to his expertness in tofu. Could you tell them your dumpling Instagram, Henry?
So Hodo is my day job. And then prior to COVID, I was teaching dumpling making classes and doing more dumpling related things on the side. Hodo is my first food job, so it was a big deal for me to come and work here. But I originally came from architecture and design and fashion and some other stuff. But anyway, so I learned a lot and I cook on the side. And my handle is Orama Sama Dumplings. So, which is maybe someone can write it. Chef too can write it.
I just did, Henry. I got you.
But so that's where I talk about Taiwanese food and dumplings.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Deeply appreciate everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Just last thing, your participation in this class today. I'm in partnership with Oakland Asian Cultural Center in Chinatown. They've been devastated in COVID, and I spent a good chunk of this year in my efforts to help them. All of these classes that you've been participating in, for those who participated with more than just this class, 50% of today's class proceeds are going to the Oakland Asian Cultural Center. Why? Because we got. Thank you so much. This is 2 David Fu. Thank you, Henry. I love you guys. I appreciate you guys. You guys stay safe, stay healthy, and happy new year. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.